Hello and welcome everybody to our Stand for Democracy event today. I'm Judith Kelly, Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy, and I'm so delighted that you are joining us today for this event in this otherwise rather dull election season. Why are we calling this a Stand for Something event series? We're doing that because Terry Sanford, the founder of the Sanford School of Public Policy, was a very engaged individual in politics. And he made very clear that he thought that if you went into politics, it wasn't just about winning. He said, you have to stand for something. And he said, even if that defeats you, you have to stand for something. This is more true than ever. And so we wanted to have this series of events around that theme. Of standing for democracy, for human rights, and so forth, things that we believe in here at the Sanford School of Public Policy. I'm really pleased that the series is being supported by the William R. Keenan Jr. Charitable Trust Endowment Fund. And by the end of the series, I will actually know how to just have that roll off my tongue, but I'm getting there. We're really grateful to them for their support, not just of this speaker series, but in general of our Sanford Endowed Lecture Series. I'm also really thankful for the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Politics and the Polis Center for Politics, whose participants are joining me here today for their support. So let me get straight to introducing our panel. Many of you will know these esteemed colleagues of ours here at the Sanford School. Deandra Rose is an assistant professor of public policy, and she's also serving as the director of research at Polis. And she focuses her research on feedback effects of sort of major landmark social policies. And her research and teaching is focused on higher education policy and American political development, political behavior, identity politics, and inequality. Pope McCorkle is the professor of the practice in the Sanford School of Public Policy and is the director of Polis. And he has been an institution in North Carolina politics for decades. I just got off a phone call with a reporter from Charlotte this morning, and he was talking about Mac. And how he's known Mac forever. He's working in state and federal candidates for North Carolina, as well as in other states across the country for decades. Phil Napoli is the James R. Shepley Distinguished Professor and also my valuable Senior Associate Dean here in the Sanford School of Public Policy and a faculty affiliate at the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy. And his work focuses on media institutions, media regulation, and policy. And he has been providing informal expert testimony on these topics to governments and bodies such as the US Senate and the Federal Communications Committee, etc. So, welcome to our panelists, welcome to our audience, and let's get started. I'm gonna go straight to Phil Napoli first. And Phil, so the thing that really we remember most from the 2016 election was that there was a big investigation about foreign influences, et cetera, and much of that had taken place through social media. In addition, we recall Facebook and release of data that ended up being used to target folks with particular advertisements, et cetera. So we've had 4 years since then, Phil. So how has the social media regulation landscape changed to make our elections safer or not? I welcome your insights on that, Phil.
Sure. I would say the regulatory landscape has changed surprisingly little. This is not to say that there are not a whole host of proposed pieces of legislation floating around Congress, but even some of the things that seemed like what we might call low-hanging fruit, something like the Honest Ads Act that puts basic disclosure requirements on political ads. Even things like that have not come to pass. What we have seen is dramatic change, however, in how these platforms police themselves. So if you were to say that there's been a regulatory change, it's been very much a self-regulatory change.
Okay, so tell us about some of these changes.
Sure.
And are they going to make us safer?
They are sort of putting their finger in the dike, if that's the appropriate metaphor here. They are trying very hard in an environment, these platforms have grown themselves to a scale that's incredibly difficult to police effectively. But we are seeing much more happen in the realm of taking down of content that has been identified as disinformation. If you went back to 2016, even the kind of flagging activities were a lot less frequent. So we're seeing a lot more of the actual removal of inauthentic accounts, a lot more removal of individual posts that don't meet the content standards that the platforms have. Now, the platforms differ amongst themselves quite a bit in terms of what their content standards are. So we don't have anything approaching yet sort of uniformity there. We've seen another number of instances over the past few months where maybe, Twitter will act one way and Facebook will act another way. But there is much more aggressive policing internally by these platforms in terms of removing problematic content.
Is one platform sort of in the forefront and setting an example that's then pulling the other ones along? And what sort of the best practices?
I think it'd be hard to say that one's in the forefront. I'd probably say, Twitter has done something interesting in terms of their refusal to accept political ads, and sadly, political advertisements have proven to be a primary source of misleading and election-related information. So that's probably something we would point to. But it's also important to remember that a lot of what they do is not entirely transparent. We're seeing inconsistency in how even their existing policies are applied. Right.
So if I'm a consumer of news from these social media platforms, how confident should I be that the election discourse is something I can rely on? What can I do to be a good consumer of these platform news?
What I tell people is, if you are going to use these platforms as the mechanism for pushing your election-related news to you, and I emphasize that a lot. We talk, as a media person, we talk a lot about push versus pull, and social media is a push medium. Then you need to be ready to do a substantial amount of additional work on your own in terms of doing some background verification on the sources that friends and family might be pushing towards you in your news feeds. We tend to rely and treat information shared with us from friends and family as inherently reliable and trustworthy. But the reality is we need to go to the original source and educate ourselves. Recognize the signs of, is this source familiar? Is this source telling me something that, given my political orientation, seems almost too amazing or too good to be true? Is it something that seems uniquely capable of getting me angry? These are some of the initial indicators that should trigger for you additional work on your own to verify it.
What about, and then we'll move on to the other panelists shortly. So we won't be just on this topic the whole time. But what about the use of data of these users of these platforms to target folks? Is that kind of practice? Do we have any reason to fear that's happening right now again?
Sure, and that's another area where the platforms have, to some extent, taken some voluntary actions in reducing the capacity to micro-target individuals on these platforms. But at the same time, we're seeing all sorts of different types of online platforms pop up that are designed primarily for data harvesting. So we're seeing, sites that present themselves online as news sites, for example, that are primarily designed to, intake email addresses and things like that are then sold to political campaigns. So there's always a new way of gathering data about us as we're.
So it sounds like if you were to give our election process as it plays out in social media a grade, it wouldn't be too great of a grade.
Again, I would encourage people to get their election news and information the good old-fashioned way, consult trusted sources directly, and not let a combination of your social network and the algorithms that control content curation on these platforms dictate what gets put in front of you.
I appreciate it, Phil. All right, so Mac, let me turn to you next, because you've been in North Carolina politics for decades, in politics and elections for decades, but especially right here in North Carolina, there's not an election that's gone by where you were asleep. So, first of all, I wonder if you can start by bringing us up to speed a little bit about what's going on in the state right now, State Board of Elections. We're reading some stories there. Can you start by briefing us on that? And then I have a follow-up question for you.
The latest, there has been a controversy developing regarding what the State Board of Elections has done to try to settle a lawsuit that was brought by Democracy North Carolina and a number of other groups. It revolves around the issue that in North Carolina law, for a mail-in ballot to be valid, you need a witness requirement from another adult. And the suit was brought early in the summer about the question of what happens when a mail-in ballot comes in and is defective, usually because of the lack of a witness, but there could be other reasons to question it.
Right.
Judge Osteen ruled that there should be some procedure for correction. The state board agreed with the plaintiffs that basically it seems like that the witness requirement could be waived as long as you got a legal affidavit from that voter saying, this is my vote.
Right.
And Judge Osteen has now come back and said, no, that really eliminates the statutory requirement that goes too far and goes too far based on, I want there to be a correction process, but this goes too far. So this is a victory for the Republicans. They were concerned about that. And we may see the need for people to correct their defective ballots by doing new ballots and having a witness signature. That's a little unclear, but I think that's where we're going.
Right, and of course the issue of a witness signature raises some questions in the time of COVID for especially older folks who may be living alone.
Yes, yes. Judge Osteen, as I understand it, said, no, I do not, he has not agreed to waive the requirement. He has said the requirement's in effect, but there could be a constitutional challenge to that, certainly.
Yeah, no, sure, there could be a constitutional challenge, but we've only got so much time here. Clock is ticking,
so
and confusion is meanwhile,
we will try to fix this.
Right.
But people will be able to correct the problems in their ballots, but it's still going to be, it might be very complicated for some people.
Right. Now, normally mail-in ballots are rejected at roughly 1% due to various either errors or they are received too late, etc. We're not necessarily talking about a large percentage of the mail-in ballots, so it could be that a larger percentage of them would be missing the signature given COVID. So,
correct. And there's deep concern that the ratio of rejection is disproportionately African American and poorer voters. So that obviously would be some constitutional issues too.
Yeah. Right. Deandra, I'd love to hear your view on that. So we'll get back to that later. But everybody out there, if you're doing a mail-in ballot, you make sure you get somebody to do that co-signature there with you. So Mac, one question I get from reporters a lot these days is, is our election safe here in North Carolina? Is it going to be okay? Will we have integrity in our elections? And we can offer opinions on that, but you can sort of put it in historical perspective. How safe is our election now, sort of relative to the elections you've witnessed over the decades?
Well, North Carolina has been a touch point for a lot of issues surrounding voter suppression. There have been court orders against the Republican Party here for certain activities that Senator Helms and other people Congressional Club used to implement. I think that the question of the safety and security of the ballot this year is up for issue in North Carolina and nationally. We will see in the next couple weeks, we're going to see an intensity of more ballot challenges, more unofficial poll watching, lots of controversy. Again, unfortunately, probably just to stir up the perception of illegitimacy, even if not the reality. North Carolina is not a state that has experience with no excuse mail-in ballots. So we obviously are experiencing some difficulty. Other states seem to be experiencing more difficulty. So it's an imponderable.
Right. No, but when we think about some of the precautions we have in place now relative to, say, do 2 decades ago, if you mailed in a mail ballot, you couldn't track it. There was no barcode you could just scan and go online and know where your ballot was.
Right. I mean, there's states with experience with these barcodes, mail-in ballot. It has been no controversy at all. So again, will this now change so that the mail ballot becomes the way, a very normalized way of procedure here in North Carolina and everywhere else? It may, but we could see some real bumps in the road in these final weeks.
Do you remember another election in North Carolina where the incumbents or the parties involved have discussed the integrity of the election itself as much as they've done during this election?
No. President Trump has brought this front and center. There have been major disputes. When I worked for deputy campaign manager for Harvey Gann in 1990, we really had lots of things going on with the Helms campaign and people in the court every day. But President Trump has taken this to a new level.
Thanks so much, Matt. So let me turn to you, Deandra. You are a scholar of structural inequality. So let's start with the comment that Matt made about signature requirements and such disproportionately affecting African-American voters or other voters of color in terms of, what are the issues in this election in terms of access to voting that you see as most disproportionately having effects on different demographic groups?
So thank you so much. I think this question, it really gets to the heart of structural inequality. So when we're talking about structural inequality, we're really thinking about unfair patterns that emerge as a result of the rules of our society, how different institutions are set up. So the idea that we might have certain, voter ID requirements or even questions about whether we have voter ID requirements that could be disproportionately suppressing for different groups of people. So, I think we know that typically the requirement to include some sort of voter ID requirement tends to suppress voter participation among seniors, among the youngest voters, and then voters of color. And so, I think in a true democracy, participation in voting is as easy as possible because the goal is to empower all eligible participants to make their voices heard in the political process. And so, there's this tension between, having standards and rules and making sure that there's not fraud in participation, and then making sure that people have equal access to the franchise.
Right. I know that Gunther Peck, who heads our Heart Leadership Program, has been working on just physical access, from public transportation to the polls, et cetera, clearly also something that disproportionately affects folks of low income. And I was also thinking, Deandra, about issues like voting rights for felons, for example.
Exactly right. So, disproportionately, minority communities, especially men in minority communities, are affected by felony disenfranchisement rules. And it's interesting because if you look at our global neighbors, at the global community, we are especially, there's a lot of retribution embedded in the US's system, in the penal system. So, there are many people who once they finish their sentences still, lose the right, or they don't regain the right to participate as voters. And what does that mean for outcomes? So the implications are that their voices are not as easily perceived or perceptible in terms of the chorus that we're getting for democracy. So what our
Right.
lawmakers are hearing, the voters who cast their support for one candidate or another. There are many cases where if you look at a particular state, like, Florida, for example, and you look at the margins of victory for certain candidates, if all voters who had been enfranchised had been able to vote, that number could have affected the outcomes of the races.
And of course, that's been an issue of contention, particularly in Florida, where the convicted felons are in the 600,000 numbers are up, if I recall that number to be correctly, which is mind-boggling.
Exactly right. To think that there are so many Americans who are disenfranchised because of this. I mean, I think that for me, I'm with you. It's just staggering to think. And I think it's an important area for reform.
It's interesting because I study international election monitoring myself, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has been monitoring elections in the United States since 2002. And one of their repeated recommendations has been around felon enfranchisement. It's never miss an opportunity to point this out. And you were mentioning in relationship to other democracies, how we really are disproportionately incarcerating people. And then when you combine that with the felon disenfranchisement, how do you, in general, Deandra, not just on this felon issue, but what are you seeing as the intersection between the Black Lives Matter movement and structural inequality and our voting and election rights?
I think this is a critical question, especially for the 2020 election, because a big question for many marginalized communities is whether they can actually trust existing institutions to represent their interests. And in many cases, there are failures where our dominant society or social institutions, governmental institutions, economic institutions are failing to effectively represent marginalized communities. So one question is, why should I participate as a voter if the system is entirely corrupt anyway? Or, I think those are the big questions. So as a nation, the US has a responsibility to get this right, because I feel like especially for younger generations that are increasingly disaffected by political institutions, by the political parties, they see all of this, many people see this as very messy and as, just not the way to get things done. And so many people will opt out if they don't feel that there's legitimacy in voting institutions in the election. So I think that really demonstrating that we're not going to suppress votes, that we're going to ensure that every eligible American who can vote has the opportunity to do so, and I think during the COVID pandemic, seeing all the things that we're seeing in the news right now, that's a big question.
Yes, for sure. I'm going to just ask you one more question, Deandra, but I also want to encourage our participants to post their questions in the Q&A. But just following up directly on this, Deandra, you talked about representation in our institutions, and we know that our colleague Nick Carnes has done work that shows that it really does matter whether the folks who are representing us in the Senate, Congress, et cetera, reflect us to some extent, at least in terms of in his work, socioeconomic status. And so we should take seriously this question. And I know that you've started to take this very seriously in terms of encouraging folks from different underrepresented minorities to get engaged in politics. So can you just tell us just a little bit about that, what you're thinking about that, what you're seeing about that around the nation? I think we've got at least four people in North Carolina, Black candidates running, and maybe a little bit about, and you can jump in here too, Mac, about what Polis is trying to do about that too with our students.
Absolutely, thank you. So, I mean, this definitely, I think, it really connects well with that previous question about institutions. So, I think in an ideal world, for people who are marginalized, they will view institutions as legitimate mechanisms for actually creating reform and change. And so in addition to raising their voices through protests, peaceful protests, and really raising their voices in the media and in different avenues, they'll also turn to political institutions and get engaged. So running for office is just one way to do that, one such way. So one of the challenges that we have in our political institutions is that there's, so much inequality embedded in representation. So I want to say like right now, women are approximately, for example, 23 to 25% of all of Congress in the US,
Mhm.
you know, which really does not represent the fact that women are more than half of the population in the US. We see that there's never been a Black woman governor in American history. There's never been a woman president. You know, we can list off all of these.
But a woman has now laid in state in the cabinet. So.
For the first time.
For the first
In
time.
all of these years. I mean, I think that's what's so stunning too. Like
Wow.
if we think about the contributions that all of our communities are making,
Yeah.
and the fact that we're still like behind in terms of these milestones, it's
Yeah.
astonishing.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think one of the biggest questions for our institutions, including higher ed institutions, is how intentional we want to be in terms of being a part of the solution for that inequality. So one of our major, I think, responsibilities in higher education is helping to build not only workers, but also citizens. So to what extent do we want to empower young leaders and to help them understand that serving in their government is a legitimate option for people who want to make change, you know, and yeah, there are many, you know, challenges. We are dealing with polarization and gridlock,
Right.
but that it's actually a worthwhile pursuit. And so we've been thinking really, really seriously about what it takes to do that kind of work. And so at Paulus, for example, we have the PEP Fellows program, the Political Engagement Project, that really works to help bring marginalized voices into the, you know, electoral arena by helping them to gain knowledge, skills, and experiences that will just accelerate their work as future leaders. We're also thinking about other projects that will help to target areas that have these sort of woefully, dismally low levels of representation among diverse voices, and to help people from those areas to get, you know, political training, policy training, coaching, mentoring, to develop a network, you know, to run for office. And so I'll just end with one, you know, point that I make often, is that apparently it takes like 7 asks to get a woman to run for office, for example. So in many cases, you know, thinking about this gender gap in political representation, you know, in many cases, men are very confident and they think, yeah, I have what it takes, or I can wing it. I can learn what I need to do. Women are much more hesitant. And so studies have shown that you have to actually do additional things to encourage women to throw their hats in the ring. And so we want to be a part of that.
That's great. Mac, did you want to add anything to that in terms of your work?
Yeah, one interesting note in an otherwise depressing, polarizing, especially racially polarizing atmosphere that we got, is that North Carolina will have an African-American, a Black lieutenant governor. We actually have, and maybe a Black woman lieutenant governor. Vaughn Holly is running for the Democrats. A very conservative African-American Republican is running Robinson. But there will be in North Carolina an African-American lieutenant governor. So that's something that people aren't talking about. Other things in particular that Paulus is doing, well, we want everybody to know about the early voting site at Karsh Alumni Center on the Duke campus, where everyone in the Duke community and the Durham community can come vote. There are other early voting sites. You can also drop it off your mail ballot, and you don't have to go into the Karsh facility. And it should be happening, I think somebody's asked that question, should be happening all across North Carolina. There should be at early voting sites the ability to drop off the mail vote. And we've been working very closely with the administration in kind of an unprecedented fashion. Coach K, President Price, lots of the staff are helping. And we're trying to focus on not just Duke students, which are very important, but also the Duke community and staff and faculty to get out and early vote. So we've been sending lots of messages through official channels, and we have a lot of students through Duke Votes, which is a group we sponsor, that's just doing incredible work on campus with student-to-student work.
That's great, Mac. Yes, we did have a question about those drop boxes, right? But and you know, as opposed to what we heard in Texas, now they're trying to shut down the number of drop boxes. Which of course is a concern because Texas is pretty big place.
They're moving to 1 per county in Texas. If that is not, if you can't figure that out.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to go to some some questions from the audience here. There's a question from Atmay Deandra about what safeguards against fraud would you support in light of our strong need for actual access to the franchise? Sort of put another way, are there any light touch and reasonable, sensible safeguards?
You know, I mean, I guess for me, one big question is about the extent to which fraud is like an actual issue. And, you know, to my mind, as I understand it, it's actually not as prominent as some political actors would hope that we believe. You know, I think for the things that I'm thinking most about are reforms that really would ensure that people actually have the access to the franchise. I think that's the sort of problem that I think I'm most interested in thinking about troubleshooting. And I would actually love to hear from the other panelists if they can think of really good, you know, sort of some safeguards or bumpers that we would have to address the fraud issue.
But you make a really good point, because so much hype has been now around the whole voting process. I think that many voters will go to the polls and find it an exceedingly normally dull affair, you know. They're just gonna go, they're gonna be like, what was all the fuss about, you know? I vote, there was nobody there, it was fine. We were socially distant, everything was fine, I cast my ballot, it was okay. You know, that's gonna be the dominant experience for everybody, and we're all gonna be scratching our heads afterwards wondering what was all this hype about.
Could I take another like pass at Admay's question though? I think maybe, you know, one suggestion I might give would be just to make sure that our elected officials are not encouraging people to vote twice. Might be my light touch recommendation.
Well, we'll send that up to the highest powers that be. Phil, I have a question for you, because you're not only an expert in social media, but because your academic career started before the true onset of social media, you were also studying print media at some time. You're still studying print media, and particularly local print media. And so if you could just give us an idea about how severe the extinction of local media has been since the 2012, 2016, 2008 elections, like in the last elections, what has that media landscape changed, and what do you think the current role is of the print media that is operating, and how is that intersecting with everything else that's going on?
Sure, yeah, and you know, to emphasize too, at the local level, what has happened is it's sort of a mix of print and digital media becoming the primary sources for people. But what's interesting, and we did a study last year that showed this, was that even as much, and this is very well documented, the declines affecting local news media, particularly traditional newspapers, in terms of numbers of declines, in terms of staffing cuts. The coronavirus pandemic has accelerated those trends in terms of gutting sort of the revenue model for local journalism.
Right.
And this applies into the digital space as well. You know, advertisers make use of automated buying systems that essentially allow them to place ads specifically avoiding stories dealing with the coronavirus. So in many ways, the news that people value the most is the news that advertisers are supporting the least. So there's some really challenging economics related to local journalism. That being said, we did a study last year that found that traditional print newspapers, even though they're a shrinking proportion of the sources available in communities, are overwhelmingly still the most significant producers of local journalism. But as these sources are declining, what our more recent research has found, and to me this is maybe one of the more troubling trends we're seeing, is the rise of hyper-partisan digital news sites that are sort of filling the vacuum left by traditional news sources.
Right.
So, and say, these local news sources are explicitly, though it's very often difficult to ascertain, are explicitly tied to political action committees, political candidates, office holders, donors, et cetera. So it's an important shift that's happening in our local journalism landscape. It's not just
Mhm.
the declines of established and trusted community news sources. It's now also the emergence of these new types of local news sources that operate
Right.
very differently and have very different objectives than do the sources that they are replacing.
Phil, so following straight up on this, Lalita wants to know about the verification of information that people gather from social media and their trusted networks. So do you think the vast majority of folks have the willingness and the inclination to seek out this kind of verification that you encourage us to do? And if not, what is the responsibility of these media platforms to provide fact checks and such?
Sure, that's a great question. And the unfortunate answer is we still see a very high frequency of people actually sharing news and information on their social media platforms without actually having read it. That it's not uncommon for things to get shared without the person actually even doing that basic initial step of reading what they are sharing, which is why and in fact, some of the platforms are instituting features that would say before you're about to share something that their fact-checking system has identified as misinformation, saying, "Are you, hey, you sure you want to share this?" So there are these sort of behavioral nudges that are at work. Fact-checking, and our colleague Bill Adair, who may be on, has really led the way as far as helping platforms like Facebook and like Google integrate fact-checking into the curation work that they do. But that doesn't equate to people relying upon it as much as we'd probably like them to at this point. I think you've gone muted on us, Judith.
Sorry, I'm competing with my son who is in Latin class, so I try to mute every now and then. I must admit, when I saw the news this morning, that Trump had tested positive for COVID, my first instinct was to send the story to, my husband and say, "Wow," even before I read it. So we all have to be really careful of the information that we get and how we check it. There's a question from Olivia Deandra. Do you want to take that question? You can read it and answer it.
Yes, please. I love this question so much. So Olivia Renault asks, and she says, "I would love it if you all could talk a little more about improving minority, particularly Black Americans' trust in the institution of voting. Has that been exacerbated in the last decade, or is this an age-old American problem? Are there any policy tools other than increasing representation that might prove successful?" I love this question so much because I think it really touches on the long arc of racial inequality in democratic voice and democratic representation. And I think, my perspective is that we have to be vigilant about voting rights, period. So at no point can we take for granted our citizenship or just think that, we can go with the flow. I think that voting rights, citizen rights, the fact that there's always some group that is excluded disproportionately. So I think democracy continues to be an aspiration for us all. Mm-hmm. So I think really thinking really big about what democracy requires and what can we do institutionally to build in mechanisms for, greater equity and voice. So I know Olivia says, aside from representation, I think representation for me is kind of the one place where we can really move the needle quickly if we can find ways to promote, underrepresented groups in terms of moving them into political power. But I do think, it's actually providing or using the media, using social media, using our personal networks to actually bring other people into the political arena and into democracy. Mm-hmm. I think also just being really intentional about teaching civics and making sure that everyone has access to the information necessary to engage as citizens, is really one place that we could do some real good.
Right. I mean, in terms of speed, as you say, with representation, if we think back, I don't know how many people remember the Red Map project, where the Republicans, in a very, very targeted way, managed to flip a non-significant number of districts because they said, if we go focus on this, and this district and upsetting these races, we can flip these congressional seats, and that'll have huge impacts down the line. And I think it only goes to show what if the entire party gets to get together around a cause like that, you could do the same. You could say, where are those seats where we can put a person of color in that seat, right? And if that was a targeted effort, we could make real progress on that.
I think that's right. I think collaboration,
Right.
yeah, I love it.
And you do, I think one of the worst things that has happened in the most recent decade that plays into all of these issues we've been talking about is the elimination of Section 5 oversight by the Justice Department on all kinds of voting plans. So until, I think it was 2013,
Right.
These kind of gerrymandered, all kinds of activities voting plan activities by state legislatures could be challenged by the Justice Department before they're implemented. So
Right.
we really have to depend on state courts to be very
Right. And I believe, as a matter of fact, that it's not that that ruling eliminated that requirement, but that ruling required that a new standard be adopted by Congress.
That's right. Congress could
has
act.
failed to do so, and until Congress does so, that ruling will essentially be effectuated the way you described, right? Which
Yes.
is so that's another important thing that's at stake in this election. I think I could imagine that if we do actually have a change in who is in power on the Hill, that 2013 ruling might indeed be followed up on with congressional legislation.
That'll probably be one of the first things
Yeah.
on the legislative agenda. Yes.
Yeah. So Carol has a question for all of you that I'll have you think about while I answer a question from Ed. So Carol says, what is an underlying issue related to the election that you think is being overlooked? So I'll let each of the panelists think about that. And while they think about that, I will answer a question from Ed Pickert, who says, in North Carolina, will mail-in ballot votes be included in reported NC results on election day? And this is a great question, because this is one of the big issues, Ed, that one of the messages from the president, of course, is that a delay in counting mail ballot votes is somehow a sign that the quality of those ballots is suspect, and that if we don't have everything counted by election day, that is sort of indicative to a problem, because that's not what we're used to either, right? But the whole issue with mail-in ballots is, we've normally done a fine job counting them on time. Last election around, we had about over 30 million of them, but if we're gonna expect maybe up to 100 million of them in this election, they will take obviously longer to count. So the whole issue is, when can we start counting them? And that varies hugely by state. In some states, you can start right away. The moment they're received, they could be open and tallied. And in other states, you can't start counting them until the day of the election, which, given the signature verification and other such matters, it will be a slower process. In North Carolina, fortunately, we are able to start counting the mail-in ballots the moment they are received, and that is indeed the practice that is being carried out right now. So given the pivotal nature of North Carolina, that is actually really important. So while I answer that question, I'm gonna now turn to each panelist and see, what do you think is an underlying issue related to the election that you think is being overlooked? Let's start with you, Phil.
And my answer is actually going to focus on our news media in particular, in terms of what I see being overlooked are actually the lessons from the 2016 election coverage. My wife has watched me flip out every time I see a story that focuses on reporting the results of a national opinion poll. Who cares? And sort of polls as news in and of themselves. Again, when we looked at all the self-evaluation that our news media did in the wake of 2016, recognizing that was incredibly problematic. So I'm seeing no learning of that lesson. I'm seeing still the irresistible urge to focus in on what we call horse race coverage too often, which is about the strategy and the underlying motivations rather than really trying to inform people about policy positions and things like that might impact their voting decisions. So in terms of being overlooked to a certain extent, I'm seeing more than I'd like to see, and this is not a blanket critique at all, but I'm seeing still a little too much failure to abide by what were widely agreed to be the lessons of from 2016's election coverage. And the third one being, the tendency to devote overwhelming amounts of attention to certain individuals when perhaps, news values might not merit it. So the ability to sort of wrest the news agenda back into their own control is still something that I see our news media, failing to do.
Sort of falling for that trap.
Right.
The time it's set up.
Easy to put a camera and or report every single tweet, and that takes up a space that could be devoted to other things.
Right. Deandra, what do you think?
Thinking about what I'm not paying enough attention to, and I think third-party voices. I think we get so, to echo Phil, set on the horse race coverage, the Democrats, the Republicans, and I think that there are so many other perspectives that are kind of drowned out because of how we do elections in the US. And I wish there were more of a platform for those other voices and perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Mac, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that our election process has been leaving lots of people on the sidelines, unclear about their futures and how politics speaks to them. And I think the first debate that we just saw probably accentuates that trend. So I'm especially worried about just the underlying issue of people's trust in democracy, being able to go forward and feeling like, and again, from left, right, center, I think there are just a lot of people who feel like American politics does not speak to them. And I'm concerned about that, regardless of who wins on November 3rd.
Mm. So Gunther has asked a question, and I'm going to read it to you and see what thoughts you have. But I would also note that Gunther might actually be one of the best people to answer this question. And so maybe if he wants to weigh in, he can. But Gunther asked, our state has been a poster child of late, as you all know, for undemocratic experiments, restrictions on voting rights, gerrymandering, and the like. Do you think there are opportunities for North Carolina to lead in creating lasting democracy reforms? And what do you think that might look like? So Gunther, I see, has jumped on. Gunther, panelist and director of the Heart Leadership Program. Over to you.
No, I asked the question. I don't want to answer that. I have my thoughts, but
but now you're on camera, so you gotta.
No, what I first of all, it's a fantastic conversation. What I appreciate about this moment is that and to echo what Mac just said, the distrust, the corruption, it feels like a dystopian moment in our politics. And I really do think we're at a moment where, because of COVID, we can see into the systemic problems in our whole democracy. And so I think the opportunity to think about what reform will look like and can look like, this is a good moment to raise that bar. And I also, for the first time, actually have been thinking that North Carolina might be a leader in that. Mm-hmm. That rather than waiting for the federal government, this is sort of echoing the more of a conservative approach, which has been what liberals have done for a long time, hoping for the Supreme Court to settle it. There actually is an opportunity for North Carolina maybe to lead, because we've been the site of such really, abuses to what fair politics is supposed to be. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious as to what, and maybe Mac, this is really, I'm thinking like, North Carolina politics so well, and but I think anti-corruption is the message. And anti-corruption could really build a powerful reform movement. And I really don't know. It's more of an aspiration question.
Yeah.
Mac, do you have any ideas for if you had an hour to quickly draft something that was going to pass? What would you go for?
Well, two partial responses. One, North Carolina, I think Gunther's right to say that North Carolina has shown a resilience that other southern states have not shown in terms of, even if political reform is temporarily defeated, for it to rear back. And so now, for instance, we have a Supreme Court and a court system that has been doing some really good work on gerrymandering and such. So I think North Carolina can certainly be a leader among southern states. The problem for the anti-corruption movement, and Joel Fleischman and I think the first article I wrote with Joel about this was 1984, is the public financing issue, is getting private money out. And the problem is the popular perception that that's welfare for politicians. So for the anti-corruption movement, I agree with Gunther. I've spent a number of years trying to think about that, and I will not go into detail, but that is the major obstacle, I think, to a comprehensive anti-corruption, is we hit that issue. People don't like private money, but they also don't want public money to fund politicians. And that's been the big obstacle that we faced.
Gunther, if you can hang on, because I do have another question from Atmay, and it does pertain to transportation. So I know that's something you've been thinking about. So Atmay asked that, given how important it's been for all of us to be intentional about democratic participation, what can Duke faculty do to get Duke leadership's active assistance to the 35,000 workers who might need help to cast their ballots? And she says that in the field of international development, we talk a lot about intentionally planning for, quote, the last mile to be traversed. And so is anything being done about getting folks to the CARS site or to other voting sites, workers? Is that something we can do anything about, or should do anything about, are doing anything about?
I was just on a call about that.
Oh, you were? Oh, good.
But yeah,
well,
there is a lot. The hospital, the medical center, and staff in general there's a lot of more activity this year, and there's lots of understanding. Now remember about staff, they can vote at CARS, but staff may also want to vote at any early voting site in the area. So there are activity, there are plans to get people to CARS, but that is not a necessity, especially for staff. Yeah.
I think one of the obstacles, it's a fantastic question, first of all, and just to laud the Duke administration has really, they've never done this. They're actually giving employees time off to vote without, they've given them permission with, with communicating with their supervisors, the time to do that. That is just huge. The challenge is if the 35,000 Duke employees all voted at the CARS Alumni Center, we would be overwhelmed. And so I do think transportation, which is what Atmay suggested, is actually an important part of that. And so, I mean, one possibility would be, if you really are thinking of the public health and the democracy challenge of being linked, and I don't know, this would be an idle thought, but it would be great if there could be some coordination of maybe a shuttle from the hospital to another early vote site at a regular way that could be organized so that it wouldn't cause disruption, either at the other early vote site or for the Duke Hospital system. So that there is an opportunity to organize there that I think would be good to see, and faculty and staff, whatever we could do to help would be a good thing.
As long as we're sort of talking about positive things that could be done, Phil, I've noticed in social media that there seem to be a lot of little buttons saying register to vote here. Is that a positive or / new development?
No, it's funny you bring that up. In fact, you go back 6-7 years, it might be, when Facebook actually published their own research showing that demonstrating the ability to use the platform to actually increase voter turnout. So it's well established that amongst the wide range of effects that different types of campaigns on social media can have, certainly there's empirical evidence that it is possible to increase voter turnout through social media campaigns.
Well, we're coming down on the hour here, but I just will give you each one opportunity to just make a one-sentence statement to students that might be on the call about what you think that they can do. And I will start myself by issuing a challenge to students to get one fellow student who would not otherwise have voted to vote. And if you manage, you can email Gunther Peck. He'll be happy to know about that. And he will send you little smiley stickers. So Phil, do you have any final word for students?
I like that challenge part. I would challenge, be an active and not a passive news consumer. Don't wait for the news to come to you. Go seek it from sources that you have determined are trustworthy and reliable. And ideally, not overtly partisan in one direction or the other.
That's sage advice. Deandra?
I would say to continue this conversation, we hope that you'll join Polis next week on October 7th and 8th for our voting conference, where you'll hear from students from Duke, from UNC, from NCCU, and then thinkers and people who are doing amazing work for democracy next week. And we hope to see you there.
Gunther, what's your word of wisdom?
Well, we have, just to build on what you suggested, if all of our students could think about how to persuade their friend who is not going to vote to vote, I encourage you also to make that into a 30-second PSA. We're running a thing with Polis called the Why Vote competition. And the winner, there's a cash prize for the first, second, and third place. And we want to circulate the student messages throughout the Carolina schools that we're competing with. And I really do think the opportunity to have a voice is not just your vote, it's also your chance to speak to really why we must vote. And it's a great chance. So just look to the Heart Leadership site. You can see the place to submit your video. It's due a week from yesterday, October 8th.
So it turns out you can get more than smiley stickers. Who knew? Mac, last word.
Second, everything that everybody's been saying, and remind students that registration ends in North Carolina on October 9th. So if you've not registered, please register and get all your friends to register.
All right, everybody, you gotta mute yourself, unmute yourself. All right, and on the count of 3, we're all gonna say go vote. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3.
Go vote.
Go vote.
All right. See you later, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.